Sign it." Julian Croft slammed the divorce papers across the marble table, sending Amelia's coffee cup crashing to the floor. "You have nothing. You are nothing. And I want you gone by Friday." He didn't wait for her response. He turned his back on 12 years of marriage like closing a deal that had finally expired. But 3 years later, Julian made the worst mistake of his life. He sent Amelia Davenport a formal invitation to his elite gala, not as a gesture of respect, but as a weapon. He wanted her broken in front of the world. He had no idea the world was already hers. If you believe silence can be the deadliest power of all, subscribe to our channel and follow this story to the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The envelope was cream-colored heavy stock embossed with the gold Croft Industries seal that Amelia had once helped design herself. She remembered standing in the print shop on Meridian Avenue, arguing with the designer about the weight of the lettering, about whether the embossing should be raised or recessed. She had cared about every detail because she believed the company was hers too. She had believed a lot of things back then. She turned the envelope over in her hands twice before setting it on the kitchen island without opening it. She already knew what it said. Her assistant Marcus had intercepted the delivery notification 40 minutes before the physical envelope arrived, and the guest list for the Croft Industries annual gala had been in Amelia's hands for 3 days before Julian's team even finalized it. That was the difference between who she used to be and who she was now. She used to react. Now she prepared. She poured herself a glass of water, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse, overlooking the financial district, and let herself feel the particular coldness of the moment. Not pain, not anger, something quieter and more precise than either of those. Recognition. Julian Croft was inviting her to her own execution, and he was so certain of his power that it had never once occurred to him she might show up armed. Marcus appeared in his doorway, tablet in hand, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always wore them when he was thinking fast. He was 34, sharp-eyed, and had been with Amelia for 2 years. He knew better than to speak first when she was standing at that window. She spoke without turning around. "Confirm the RSVP. Tell them I accept with pleasure." Marcus made a note. "And the secondary positions, do you want to move the timeline?" "No," she said. "We hold exactly where we are. Not a single share moves before the gala. Not one document changes hands. Nothing that could be traced, nothing that could warn him." She finally turned from the window. "He invited me because he thinks I'm still the woman he left on the floor of that conference room. Let him keep thinking that. It's the last comfortable thought he'll ever have." Marcus nodded slowly. "The board confirmation from Whitmore and Chen came in this morning. That puts you at 53.4%. Amelia set her water glass down with a quiet click. "Then it's done." "Legally and completely," Marcus said. "You own Croft Industries." She didn't smile. She didn't exhale with relief. She simply said, "Good," and turned back to the window because the moment deserved to be held quietly rather than celebrated. She had been building toward this for 3 years. 3 years of discipline so absolute that some nights it had felt less like strategy and more like survival. This was not a victory lap. This was the final step of a very long, very deliberate walk. But to understand why the walk mattered, you had to understand what she had been walking away from. 12 years. That was how long Amelia Davenport had given to Julian Croft. She had met him when he was still assembling Croft Industries from 3 failing mid-size firms and a vision that most people in the room thought was reckless. She had believed in that vision before the banks did, before the board did, before his own family did. She had sat across from venture capitalists and argued Julian's case with a clarity and intelligence that left grown men reconsidering their hesitation. She had restructured his early debt contracts, identified the acquisition targets that became the foundation of his empire, and spent the better part of a decade building something she genuinely thought belonged to both of them. She had also loved him. That was the part she didn't talk about anymore, but it was true, and it mattered, because it was the part that made the ending so catastrophic. The first signs had been subtle enough that she'd explained them away. Julian working later. Julian less present at dinners. Julian with a particular coolness when she brought up plans for the future. She had attributed it to pressure, to ambition, to the particular strain of being a man who had built something enormous and was terrified of losing it. She had been patient because she thought patience was love. She had been wrong. Patience had just given him more time. She found out about Isabella on a Thursday morning in March, not through a confrontation or a confession, but through a document. Amelia had been going through quarterly financials for a subsidiary and found a series of private hotel charges that didn't match any business account she recognized. She was an extraordinarily careful woman. She followed the thread, and within 48 hours, she had not just confirmed the affair, but understood how long it had been happening. 14 months. Julian had been with Isabella Sterling for 14 months before Amelia found out. And Isabella was not a stranger. Isabella had been Amelia's closest friend for 9 years. They had vacationed together. They had been each other's emergency contacts. Amelia had introduced them. She sat alone in her home office for 2 hours after confirming it, and she did not cry. She was too stunned to cry. The shock was not just emotional, it was structural, like discovering that the building you had lived in for a decade was built on a foundation that had never actually been there. She confronted Julian that evening, not screaming, not throwing things. She laid out what she had found with the same precise calm she brought to every difficult conversation, and she watched his face as he understood she already knew everything. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain. He looked at her with something she could only describe as relief, and he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this for 6 months. I'm in love with her. I want a divorce." Amelia had said, "I see," and left the room. She thought that was the worst night. She was wrong. The worst came 3 weeks later when Julian called a press conference under the guise of a company restructuring announcement. She hadn't known about it until Marcus, who was then still working for a financial news outlet, sent her a message that simply said, "Turn on your television right now." Julian stood at the podium in the Croft Industries lobby, flanked by board members and communications staff, and announced that he was restructuring the company's leadership. And then, unprompted, he looked directly at the camera and said that for too long the company had been held back by poor personal counsel, that certain individuals close to him had made decisions based on emotion rather than strategy, that he was grateful to be moving forward with clarity. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every person in the financial world knew exactly who he meant. Amelia Davenport, the ex-wife, the woman who had been married to Julian Croft for 12 years, had just been publicly described as a liability, as dead weight, as a mistake he was grateful to be free of. The calls started within the hour. Business contacts suddenly unreachable, event invitations quietly rescinded. A foundation board she'd sat on for 4 years sent a polite letter suggesting her presence might create complications. Even her brother Daniel, who had built his entire career on connections Julian had provided, called to tell her he thought it best they keep their distance for a while. She had stood in her kitchen, the one she would eventually leave in the house she would eventually sell, and understood that she had not just lost a marriage. She had been erased. Julian had not simply left her. He had made a point of leaving her publicly, deliberately, with enough force that everyone watching would understand she was not to be associated with anymore. She had one night of complete collapse. One night where she sat on the floor of her bedroom and felt the full weight of everything at once: the betrayal, the humiliation, the loneliness, the fury. She let herself feel all of it, because she knew she could only afford one night, and she wanted to feel it completely, so she would never have to feel it again. In the morning, she got up. She packed one bag. She left the house and the name it represented behind, at least in practice, and she began to think. This is where most people in her position made a critical mistake. They fought publicly. They made statements. They hired aggressive attorneys and sought visible vindication. They let their anger be the engine. Amelia understood in those first cold weeks that anger was fuel, but noise was waste. If she was going to rebuild, it had to be invisible. Julian had to believe she was gone. Everyone had to believe she was gone. Because the moment they stopped watching for her was the moment she could actually move. She relocated to a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one from her former life would think to look. She spent 6 weeks doing nothing but reading financial law, corporate acquisition structures, hostile takeover precedents, equity network theory. She already knew this material, but she studied it again as if she were encountering it for the first time, because she wanted to find every edge she had previously overlooked. She reached out carefully and selectively to 3 people. The first was Diane Whitmore, a 71-year-old retired corporate attorney who had quietly despised Julian Croft for a decade and had once told Amelia at a dinner no one else remembered that she was the only genuinely intelligent person in that marriage. The second was Raymond Chen, a Hong Kong-based equity strategist who had built his reputation on seeing positions others missed. The third was Marcus Webb, who had written 2 investigative pieces on Croft Industries' financial irregularities that Julian's legal team had successfully suppressed, and who was now apparently looking for something more meaningful to do with his skills than watch his work get buried. She met each of them separately. She told each of them the same thing. She had a plan it would take at least 3 years. It required absolute silence. And if it worked, it would be one of the cleanest and most complete corporate repositionings any of them had ever seen. She told them what she needed from each of them, and then she waited to see who was in. All 3 said yes within 48 hours. What followed was 3 years of work so meticulous and so patient that there were stretches where even Amelia had to remind herself that the goal existed. She built a series of holding companies under names that carried no trace of her own. She began acquiring minority positions in Croft Industries subsidiaries, small enough not to trigger disclosure thresholds, spread across enough entities to avoid pattern recognition. Diane restructured each position with the kind of legal precision that made them simultaneously invisible and completely ironclad. Raymond identified the specific shareholder blocks that could be moved without alerting Julian's internal financial monitors. She lived quietly. She dressed simply. She attended no events where she might be recognized. When financial journalists wrote about Croft Industries, which they did regularly because Julian was aggressively building his public profile with Isabella on his arm, Amelia read every word and felt nothing except a cold professional interest in what the coverage revealed about the company's vulnerabilities. Julian, for his part, was thriving. Or performing thriving, which he had come to understand was his particular gift. He was at every major event, every conference, every charity gala that mattered. Isabella was beside him constantly, and the 2 of them had become a fixture in the kind of publications that covered wealth as though it were a personality trait. He had gotten everything he wanted. The woman he'd called deadweight had obligingly disappeared. His company was posting strong numbers, and the world had moved on. He didn't think about Amelia. That was his most fundamental error. Not thinking about her meant not watching for her. Not watching for her meant not seeing what she was doing in the margins of markets he thought he controlled. He had dismissed her so completely that she had become functionally invisible, and invisibility in the hands of someone who knew how to use it was the most dangerous position in any room. The acquisition accelerated in the final year, Diane and Raymond working in concert 3 separate equity blocks, moving in coordination across a 6-week window that looked on any individual exchange filing like routine portfolio adjustments by unrelated institutional investors. By the time the positions consolidated, Amelia held 53.4% of Croft Industries. She owned it. Legally completely, and without a single procedural error that could be challenged. She had told no one outside her 3 advisors, not a journalist, not a contact, not an old friend who might have been gratified to hear it. She had held the secret with both hands for 3 years, and she was not going to release it for anything less than the perfect moment. Julian had just handed her the perfect moment. The gala invitation sat on her kitchen island still unopened. She walked back to it, picked it up, and this time slid her finger under the seal. The card inside was predictably beautiful, heavy cream paper, engraved lettering the Croft Industries logo centered at the top. A formal invitation to the annual Elite Gala black tie, the Grand Meridian Hotel, 8 o'clock. And at the bottom in a line that she suspected Julian had personally insisted on a handwritten edition in his own script, "It would mean so much to see you there, Amelia. For old time's sake." She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Marcus, who had reappeared in the doorway. "He wrote it himself," she said. "That last line." Marcus glanced at the card. The handwriting. "The sentiment," she said. "He wants me to feel the graciousness. He wants me to walk in grateful that he included me. He wants the narrative to be that he's magnanimous enough to invite the woman he discarded, and she's small enough to show up anyway." She set the card down with the same quiet click as the water glass. He has constructed an entire story in his head about how that evening will go. And we're going to tell a different one, Marcus said. We're not going to tell anything, Amelia said. We're going to let the truth speak. That's always been the plan. We don't announce, we don't perform, we don't make speeches before the moment. We walk in, we let the evening proceed exactly as Julian intends, and we wait. She looked at Marcus steadily. He is going to humiliate me in front of every person who matters in this world. He's going to make that room believe I am exactly who he says I am. And then the board chairman is going to speak. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You're not nervous. It wasn't a question, but she answered it like one. I was nervous for 3 years, she said. Every morning I checked the positions. Every night I reviewed the filings. Every time I got on a call with Diane or Raymond, there was a version of me that wondered if something had slipped, if someone had noticed, if Julian's team had somehow found the thread and followed it back. She picked up her water glass again and moved toward the window. I was nervous the entire time I was building it. Now that it's built, there's nothing left to be nervous about. She looked out at the city, at the towers of glass and steel, where money moved in currents invisible to most people, where power lived in documents and ownership stakes and board votes, rather than in the loud performances of men who needed the world to see their confidence because they weren't entirely certain it was real. Julian had needed everyone to see him discard her. He had needed the audience. He had needed the press conference and the public narrative and the slow social erasure, because simply leaving wasn't enough for him. She had to be made small. She had to be made into a lesson. She had become one, just not the lesson he intended. In the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, 4 days from now, Julian Croft was going to stand in front of the most powerful people in the country and deliver what he believed was the final word on Amelia Davenport. He was going to smile that particular smile of his, the one that looked like confidence, but was actually performance, and he was going to let her feel the weight of every eye in the room, confirming his version of her story. And then the truth was going to walk into the room behind her, and Julian's entire narrative was going to collapse in real time in front of everyone he had ever needed to impress. She had not planned this moment out of cruelty. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. There had been a version of this plan in the early months that was driven by fury, where she had imagined the most brutal possible exposure, where she had wanted him to feel every humiliation she had felt amplified and returned. She had moved through that version and left it behind because she understood that cruelty was just another form of noise, and noise had never been her method. What she wanted was simpler and more complete than revenge. She wanted accuracy. She wanted the record corrected. She wanted the people who had watched Julian publicly diminish her to understand with absolute clarity and in front of the same witnesses that they had been watching a man dismantle something he didn't have the intelligence to recognize as extraordinary. She wanted the correction to be visible and irrefutable and permanent. She wanted the truth told in a room full of people who had believed his version of it. That was all, and it was enough. She finished her water and set the glass down. Tell Diane I want to speak with her tomorrow morning, and tell Raymond the timeline holds. She walked toward her office. And Marcus. Yes, find me something appropriate to wear to a gala, she said without turning around. Something that says I've been doing very well. She closed the office door behind her and sat down at her desk, where 3 years of work lived in organized files and carefully dated documentation, and where the future she had built in absolute silence waited quietly for the moment she would finally allow it to speak. 4 days. Julian would have 4 more days of believing he had won. She had given him 3 years of that belief, and she could afford 4 more days. Patience was not passive. Patience was the architecture of everything she had built. Patience was the reason she was going to walk into that gala as the owner of his empire, while he stood at its center, believing he had invited the ghost of a woman he'd defeated. She opened her laptop and began to work. The dress arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days before the gala, in a matte black garment bag with no label on the outside. Amelia had described exactly what she wanted to the stylist. Not flashy, not aggressive, nothing that would read as trying too hard, and what arrived was precisely right. Deep navy structured at the shoulder, utterly quiet in the way that only genuinely expensive things manage to be quiet. The kind of dress that didn't announce itself. The kind that made people look twice because they couldn't immediately explain why they were looking. She hung it on the back of the closet door and went back to work. Marcus knocked at 10 that morning and came in without waiting, which meant something had moved. He had 2 phones in his hand, which meant something had moved fast. Croft's PR team sent a revised guest list to the hotel coordinator this morning, he said, setting one phone on her desk. They added a media section, 4 journalists, 2 photographers, and a video crew from Meridian Financial Network. Amelia looked at the screen. He's filming it. He's filming it, Marcus confirmed. My read is he wants footage of the gala for the quarterly investor presentation next month. But the placement, he pointed to a section of the guest list, the media is positioned directly adjacent to the main stage, which means if anything happens on that stage, it gets captured. Amelia leaned back in her chair slowly. He didn't plan that for my benefit. No, he planned it for his own, but it works for ours. She thought about it for a moment, turning the information over with the same deliberate care she gave every variable. Then she said, leave it. We don't touch the media placement. We don't try to limit the coverage. We don't do anything that could be interpreted as damage control before the damage has even happened. She looked at Marcus steadily. If he wants cameras in the room, then cameras will be in the room, and they will record exactly what happens. Marcus made a note. Diane called this morning. She wants to walk through the board confirmation sequence one more time. Schedule it for this afternoon, and tell Raymond I want confirmation that the Chen Whitmore block is locked. No movement, no communication that touches any Croft-adjacent account until after the gala. We are completely still until Saturday night. Understood. Marcus paused at the door. There's one more thing. She waited. Your brother called the office line. Not your cell, the office line. The room went a degree colder. Amelia didn't move. What did he want? He didn't say specifically. He said he'd heard you were attending the gala and that he wanted to talk before then. He said it was important. Marcus watched her carefully. He left a number. I know his number, she said quietly. She was still for a long moment. Then, don't return the call. Don't acknowledge the message. If he calls again, you haven't been able to reach me. You don't want to know what he's going to say. I already know what he's going to say, Amelia said. He's going to tell me not to go. He's going to tell me it isn't worth it, that I should protect what I've rebuilt, that engaging with Julian's world again is a mistake. He's going to frame it as concern. She picked up her pen and returned her eyes to the document in front of her. What it actually is fear. Daniel built his entire professional life on Julian's goodwill. If something shifts at Croft Industries, Daniel's position shifts with it. He doesn't know what I've done. He just senses something is about to change and he wants to position himself safely. She marked a line in the document. He made his choice 3 years ago. He doesn't get a preview of mine. Marcus left without another word. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, pausing only for the call with Diane, which ran 90 minutes and covered every procedural step of the board sequence with the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation. Diane Whitmore had been practicing corporate law since before Amelia was born, and she spoke about legal architecture the way a master builder spoke about load-bearing walls, with complete authority and zero tolerance for approximation. The confirmation documents are filed and sealed. Diane said, her voice carrying the particular dry steadiness that Amelia had come to find deeply reassuring. The board notification was issued this morning through the proper channels. Every director has received formal communication. The chairman has his copy. Nothing about this can be contested on procedural grounds because we did not leave a single procedural gap. And if Julian's legal team tries to challenge the acquisition itself, they will try, Diane said simply, and they will fail. We spent 2 years making sure of it. Every position was acquired through properly disclosed entities. Every threshold was respected. Every filing was current. His attorneys are very good, Amelia, but they are going to spend the first 72 hours looking for a door and finding nothing but solid wall. Good, Amelia said. That's all I needed to hear. She slept well that night, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake running scenarios. Instead, she fell asleep quickly and deeply, the way she sometimes did after finishing a particularly complex piece of analysis, the particular exhaustion of something finally being complete. On Wednesday, she received a delivery she had been expecting, a large flat package from Raymond Chen's New York office, no return address, which contained a single document inside a sealed legal envelope, which she did not open because she didn't need to. She knew what it was. She placed it in the interior pocket of the structured portfolio case she would be carrying to the gala and went back to her desk. On Thursday, something unexpected happened. She was walking through the lobby of her building, not thinking about the gala, thinking about a completely unrelated tax structure question she needed to resolve before end of quarter, when she nearly collided with a woman coming through the glass doors from the street. Both of them stepped back. Both of them looked up. It was Claire Heston, Julian's former head of investor relations, a woman Amelia had worked alongside for 4 years and genuinely respected. Claire had been quietly pushed out of Croft Industries 8 months after the divorce in the kind of bloodless restructuring that Julian performed on anything he associated with a period he wanted to erase. Claire stared at her. "Amelia." "Claire." Amelia kept her voice entirely neutral. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Claire said in a rush, as if she'd been holding it, "I heard you're going to the gala Saturday." "I am." Claire stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I never agreed with how he handled things, with you. I thought it was wrong, and I said so, which is probably part of why I'm not there anymore." She looked directly at Amelia, and there was something in her expression that was neither pity nor admiration, but some careful mixture of both. "Are you okay? Genuinely?" "I'm very well," Amelia said. "Thank you for asking." "He's going to try to—" Claire stopped again, visibly uncertain. "I know what he's going to try to do," Amelia said quietly. "I appreciate the concern. I really do." She held Claire's gaze for a moment and let just enough warmth through to be real without being revealing. "Enjoy your Thursday, Claire." She walked to the elevator and didn't look back. In the elevator going up, she thought about Claire's face, the worry in it, the assumption, sympathetic and genuine, that Amelia was walking into something difficult and painful that she might not fully understand. Even the people who cared about her, even the ones who respected her, still saw what Julian had trained the world to see. A woman who had been broken by a powerful man and was now perhaps courageously but perhaps unwisely walking back into his orbit. No one had corrected that image. She had worked very hard to preserve it. But there was something clarifying about seeing it reflected back at her from someone who actually meant well, because it reminded her of the precise distance between who the world believed she was and who she had actually become. That distance was the entire architecture of her plan. The elevator opened. She walked back to her office. She sat down, and for the first time since she had received the invitation, she allowed herself a full and unguarded minute of thinking about Saturday night. Not strategically, not analytically, just honestly. She thought about walking into the Grand Meridian Ballroom and seeing Julian for the first time in 3 years. She thought about the expression on his face when he noticed her, the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed how to seem magnanimous. She thought about the moment later in the evening when he would find a way in front of the right people to make her smallness part of the narrative. She thought about what it would feel like to stand inside that moment and say nothing, because nothing would be required. She thought about the board chairman stepping forward, and she thought about Julian's face in that particular instant, not in the way she had imagined it during the angry months with any satisfaction, but with the sober recognition that this was a moment of profound correction. The truth asserting itself in front of the people who had been given the lie. She thought about her brother who had chosen safety over her, and about Isabella who had chosen opportunity over their friendship, and about every person who had quietly moved away when Julian signaled that moving away was the socially intelligent thing to do. She did not feel rage about any of them. She felt something older and quieter, a clear-eyed understanding that people chose themselves when they were frightened, and that the best answer to that was simply to make sure she had chosen herself too. She had, completely and without apology. The minute passed. She returned to work. Friday arrived with a particular kind of bright, cold clarity, the kind of morning that felt like punctuation. Marcus came in at 8 with coffee and the final confirmation she had been waiting for. Raymond had sent overnight documentation verifying the last position lock. Every piece was in place. 53.4% legally sealed, procedurally perfect, documented in triplicate across multiple jurisdictions. Diane had reviewed everything the previous evening and sent a single message at 11:15 that said only, "We are ready." Amelia drank her coffee and read through the final documents herself, not because she didn't trust the work, but because this was the kind of moment that deserved the full attention of the person it mattered most to. She read every page. She checked every number. She found nothing that concerned her, which was exactly what she had expected because Diane Whitmore did not make errors. Marcus was quiet through all of it. When she set the last document down, he said, "How are you feeling?" "Focused," she said. "That's not the same as okay." "No," she agreed. "But it's what's true." He nodded and refilled her coffee without being asked. She spent the afternoon on unrelated work, deliberately a restructuring question for a separate client matter and equity analysis that had nothing to do with Croft Industries. She had learned over 3 years that the most dangerous thing a person could do in the final stretch of a long plan was to spend too much time looking at it. You either trusted the work or you didn't, and she trusted it completely. At 6 in the evening, her phone rang. Not her office line and not Marcus's routing number, her personal cell, which almost no one had. She looked at the screen. Daniel. She let it ring 4 times. Then she answered. "Amelia." His voice was tighter than she remembered. 3 years had put something in it that hadn't been there before, a strain that lived under the professional polish he'd always maintained. "Thank God, I've been trying to reach you." "I know," she said. A pause. "So you got my message?" "I got your message." Another pause longer. "You're going tomorrow night?" "Yes." "Amelia, listen to me." She could hear him moving, the sound of a door closing, the particular quality of someone making sure they were alone. "I don't know what you're thinking, but this is not a good idea. Julian, he's not in a good place. His numbers are softer than they're letting on publicly. The board is not as unified as it was 2 years ago, and when things get tight, he gets mean. You know that. You know how he gets." His voice dropped. "He didn't invite you to be kind. You know that." "Yes," she said. "I know that." "Then why are you going?" She considered the question. Not what to say, she knew what she would say, but how much of it was fair to give him. He was her brother. He had failed her, but he was her brother, and the failure had come from fear rather than malice, which she had eventually separated out from how she felt about it. He was calling because he was afraid for her or afraid for himself or both, and he didn't understand the difference. "Because I have things to attend to," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means there are matters related to the company that need to be present for Saturday evening, and I intend to be present for them." Silence. Then carefully. "What matters? What are you talking about?" She made a decision, not to tell him she would not tell him, but to give him just enough that he would understand afterward that she had tried to prepare him. "Daniel, when have you ever known me to walk into a room unprepared?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Never." "Then trust that." "Amelia." "I have to go," she said. "Enjoy your Friday evening." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. She had given him what she could. What he did with it was his to navigate. She went to bed at 10:30, read for 20 minutes, and was asleep by 11. Saturday arrived without ceremony. She was up at 6, which was her normal hour. She worked for 3 hours on the unrelated client matter, finished the equity analysis she'd started Friday, and responded to a series of emails that had been waiting since midweek. At 9, Marcus arrived with her portfolio case and 2 items she had asked him to bring: a printed copy of the sealed acquisition confirmation and a single index card with 4 handwritten notes on it that she had prepared herself. "Everything is in order," he said. "Car is scheduled for 7:15. Diane will be inside the venue by 7:30. Raymond's representative, his associate Nolan, will be seated with the board group by 7:45. And the chairman, confirmed. He has his documentation, he has his timing, and he has your direct line if anything moves unexpectedly." "It won't move unexpectedly," she said, "but give him the number anyway." She spent the afternoon quietly. She ate lunch at the kitchen island and read a novel she'd been meaning to finish for 2 weeks. At 4, she called her mother not to discuss the gala, not to prepare anyone, just to talk, because her mother was 73 and had been through enough of her own difficulties to deserve a conversation that wasn't about strategy. They talked for 40 minutes about her mother's garden and a trip her mother was planning to the coast, and a book they had both read and disagreed about, and Amelia felt by the end of the call completely herself, clear and settled and entirely present. At 5:30, she began getting ready. The navy dress fit exactly as it had when she tried it the first time. She kept her jewelry simple, a single strand of pearls that had been her grandmother's, clean and personal and impossible to misread as performance. Her hair, her makeup, everything deliberate and quiet. Nothing aggressive, nothing that could be read as trying. She looked at herself in the mirror for exactly one moment, not out of vanity, but out of the particular discipline of making sure she was ready. She was. She looked like herself. Not the version of herself that Julian had put in front of the world, not the diminished ghost of a woman who had made a powerful man's mistake herself. Composed, present, and absolutely prepared. At 7:15, she picked up her portfolio case, walked through her apartment, and closed the door behind her. In the car going downtown, Marcus sat beside her with his tablet running through the final sequence one more time in quiet, efficient shorthand. She listened, confirmed each point, and then told him to put the tablet away. They rode the last 8 minutes in silence. The Grand Meridian came into view through the windshield lights, blazing cars stacking at the entrance, the particular choreographed glamour of a major event in full motion. She watched it approach through the glass. Somewhere inside that building, Julian Croft was standing in a custom tuxedo, greeting his guests, performing his flawless confidence, counting on the evening ahead to go exactly as he had planned. He had spent the entire day preparing for the wrong story. The car stopped. The door opened. Amelia Davenport stepped out into the cold night air, portfolio case in hand, and looked at the entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel with the same calm, clear expression she brought to every difficult room she had ever walked into. She walked forward. The lobby of the Grand Meridian was exactly what she had expected, which meant it was also exactly what she had prepared for. The noise hit first that particular blend of champagne glasses and expensive cologne and 100 overlapping conversations that existed in the specific key of people performing their wealth for one another. She had lived inside that sound for 12 years. It no longer impressed her, and it no longer intimidated her, which was perhaps the most important thing 3 years of distance had given her. She checked her portfolio case at the coat station, keeping only the sealed envelope inside her clutch, and moved into the main reception space with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere to rush to because they had already arrived exactly where they intended to be. The first person to see her was a woman named Patricia Gould, the wife of a Croft Industries board member, who had been one of the first to quietly remove Amelia from her social rotation after the divorce. Patricia was standing with 2 other women near the champagne station, and she looked up with the particular expression of someone encountering a fact they had not accounted for in their planning. Surprise, then something more complicated. Then a very careful smile. "Amelia," Patricia said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Julian was kind enough to invite me," Amelia said with a warmth so precise it was impossible to argue with. "It's lovely to see you, Patricia. You look wonderful." She moved on before Patricia could recalibrate. 7:43. 13 minutes before the formal program began. She moved through the reception with purpose, greeting people she recognized, accepting the surprise on their faces without reacting to it, planting herself in the geography of the room with the same intentionality she had brought to every acquisition over the last 3 years. She needed to be seen. She needed Julian to know she was there well before he had planned to acknowledge her, so that he could begin performing his magnanimity early and set the stage himself without realizing she was directing it. She found her table, which was positioned, she noted without surprise, at the extreme periphery of the main floor behind 2 other rows of tables with a partially obstructed sightline to the stage. Julian's team had seated her in the social equivalent of a back corner. She looked at the placement card with her name on it, then looked across the room toward the main stage and the elevated table where the board members and major investors were positioned, and she made a very simple calculation. She picked up her placement card, carried it to the table adjacent to the board section, which had 2 empty seats and whose card holders had not yet arrived, and set it down next to a man she recognized immediately. Walter Grayson, the chairman of the Croft Industries board, who looked up from his phone as she approached, and whose expression shifted in the space of a single second through surprise and into something that was very close to relief. "Amelia," he said quietly. "Walter," she said, sitting down beside him. "I thought we might want to be closer tonight." He glanced around the table briefly, then back to her. "Diane told me you'd be calm about all of this." "Was she right?" "She's always right," he said with the faint, dry humor of a man who had spent too many decades in corporate life to be surprised by anything. "Everything is in order on my end. Documentation is secured. The sequence will go at my discretion as agreed." "As agreed," she confirmed. She set her clutch on the table. "Let him run the first hour. Let it go however he intends. When the moment presents itself, you'll know it." Walter nodded once with the weight of a man who understood exactly what the next few hours contained. "He doesn't know you're here yet." "He will shortly," Amelia said. "And when he does, the performance begins. Let's let him perform." She turned toward the room with the composed expression of a woman entirely at ease, picked up a glass of water from the table service and waited. She didn't wait long. At 7:51, she felt it before she saw it, a change in the quality of the room's social current, the specific ripple of attention that moved through a crowd when someone important had entered or done something worth noticing. She followed the ripple back to its source and found Julian Croft standing 30 feet away mid-greeting with a cluster of investors, who had just been told something by the man beside him that caused Julian to turn his head and look directly across the room, at her. The distance between them was enough that she could read his expression without him being able to read the precision of her attention. She watched his face move through a sequence that he couldn't fully control recognition then, a microsecond of something that might have been uncertainty, immediately covered by the warm and practiced expansion of his public smile. He said something brief to the investors beside him and began moving toward her with the deliberate ease of a man who had choreographed this moment in his head and was now executing it exactly as planned. Amelia set her glass down. She stood. He crossed the room and arrived in front of her with his hand already extended, smile already deployed. Up close, he looked well expensive, suit-controlled posture, the particular burnished quality of a man who had been performing success long enough that it had become something close to real. Isabella was not beside him. She would be somewhere in the room, Amelia knew, positioned carefully enough to be visible without being immediately adjacent to this interaction. "Amelia," Julian said, and his voice carried exactly the tone she had anticipated. Warm, slightly surprised, performing graciousness for the benefit of anyone within earshot. "I'm so glad you came." "Of course," she said, shaking his hand with a firmness that matched his exactly. "It's a beautiful event, Julian. You've always known how to put these together." His smile registered the compliment with the ease of a man accustomed to them. "You look well," he said, and she could hear him recalibrating as he said it, not quite expecting the steadiness in front of him. "It's been a long time." 3 years, she said simply. 3 years. He repeated it lightly, as if duration were a neutral thing. Then, with the particular careful casualness of a man deploying a blade, "I wasn't sure you'd come, honestly. I imagine these events must be a bit—" He paused just long enough, a lot after everything. She looked at him with complete equanimity. "Not at all," she said. "I've been keeping quite busy, but I appreciate you thinking of me." He searched her face for a moment, and she gave him nothing except the pleasant, settled expression of a woman who was exactly where she meant to be. She watched him decide that she was performing bravery, that behind the composure was the fragility he had expected, and she watched him settle into that conclusion like a man lowering himself into a comfortable chair. "Well," he said, "I hope you enjoy the evening." His eyes moved just briefly and deliberately to the table behind her, the table she was supposed to be sitting at, which he could see was now empty of her placement card. His gaze returned to her with a new quality she clocked immediately. He had noticed. He didn't know where she had moved, but he had noticed she had moved. He would find out shortly. For now, he simply said, "I'll look forward to catching up later," and moved away with the clean efficiency of a man who had accomplished the first step of his plan. He had been seen greeting her publicly with generosity, which established the narrative he wanted. Magnanimous Julian. Julian who bore no grudges. Julian who could afford to be kind. She watched him go and picked up her water glass. 8 o'clock arrived. The room organized itself into the formal dinner configuration, and the first hour proceeded exactly as Julian had designed it. The food was exceptional. The presentations were polished. A series of speakers delivered carefully prepared remarks about Croft Industries' performance and outlook, each one framed to paint Julian as the singular visionary at the center of the company's success. He sat at the head of the main table and received it all with the performance of a man who was gracious enough to be slightly uncomfortable with the praise, which was itself the most sophisticated form of ego she had ever seen him deploy. Across the room, she watched investors responding, watched the board members at her own table watching the room, watched Nolan Raymond's associate, young and sharp-faced, seated 3 positions away, maintaining the kind of careful stillness that meant he was tracking everything. 40 minutes and something small happened that the room barely noticed. A board member named Gerald Harmon leaned across to the man beside him, another board member, Thomas Reek, and said something in a low voice. Thomas Reek nodded slowly, and his eyes moved briefly toward Amelia. Then back to Julian on the stage, then down to his phone. She did not react, but she noted it. Gerald Harmon was one of 2 board members she had not been entirely certain about in the final weeks of the acquisition. His block of shares had been the last to move, and it had moved because of documentation Diane had prepared. Documentation that was impeccable, but she had understood that impeccable legal work and personal comfort were not always the same thing. Harmon had sat with the reality of what she'd done for approximately 72 hours before confirming his alignment. The fact that he was now looking at her and then at Julian suggested he was sitting with it again in real time in a room full of witnesses. Good, let him sit with it. The truth had a weight that increased with proximity, and they were all in the same room now. Julian took the stage at 8:55 for his keynote address. She had read the summary his communications team had distributed in advance. She had operatives in enough places that advance materials were rarely a surprise, and she knew the structure of what was coming. He would open with the company's performance numbers. He would move into his vision for the next 5 years. And somewhere in the middle, framed as a personal reflection on growth and clarity, he would make a remark about his past, about choices he had left behind, about the cost of carrying weight that didn't serve the mission. He had done versions of this speech before in smaller rooms in various configurations. She had read the transcripts. He never named her directly. He was too controlled for that. But the references were always precise enough that anyone who knew the history understood exactly who he meant. She sat with her hands folded on the table and listened. He was a genuinely compelling speaker. She had always acknowledged that even in the years when she had loved him, and especially in the years since when she had not. He moved through the performance numbers with a fluency that made complexity seem effortless, and he transitioned into the vision portion with a momentum that kept the room's attention exactly where he needed it. She watched investors leaning forward, watched journalists, recorders staying active. Then he reached the personal reflection segment, and his voice shifted to a register that was carefully calibrated to sound like vulnerability. "There was a period," he said, pausing with practiced weight, "when I allowed the people closest to me to define my limitations, when I confused loyalty with wisdom and proximity with competence." Another pause. "Letting go of that really letting go was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done for this company. And I think everyone in this room understands that the cost of clarity is sometimes steep." He smiled, the particular smile that was designed to look rueful while actually conveying pride. But the results speak for themselves. The room offered an appreciative murmur. Several people applauded. At her table, Walter Grayson made a very small sound, not quite a word. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Julian, and her expression entirely neutral. Julian's gaze moved across the room in the practiced sweep of a man working every section of his audience, and when it reached her table, it stopped. Just for a moment. Just long enough to make sure she had heard. She looked back at him with the same settled attention she had maintained all evening, and she watched him interpret that stillness as pain she was suppressing, and she watched him feel satisfied about it. He looked away. He continued his speech. What Julian did not see, because he was looking at the room the way powerful men looked at rooms, which was to say he was looking for confirmation rather than information, was what was happening at the edges. 3 board members had checked their phones in the last 4 minutes. 2 investors from the secondary table had broken away from the applause a beat early. Nolan had shifted in his chair and made a note on the small card he kept in his breast pocket. She saw all of it. She had trained herself to read rooms the way others read text, not for what was presented, but for what was moving underneath. The speech ended, applause genuine and substantial. Julian descended from the stage with the ease of a man who had just confirmed everything he believed about himself. He was immediately surrounded by the cluster of congratulatory attention that major events generated, and she watched him work at hand after hand, smile after smile, the precise social machinery of a man who had practiced this until it was indistinguishable from authentic. Then Isabella found her way to his side. Amelia watched without any particular feeling. Isabella Sterling was beautiful in the aggressive, curated way she had always been. Everything perfectly chosen. Everything slightly too much. She took Julian's arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who had won something and needed the room to know it, and she looked across the crowd with the scanning attention of someone who had been told Amelia was here and was now locating her. Their eyes met across 30 feet of noise and candlelight. Isabella's expression went through 3 phases in quick succession: recognition, wariness, and then a manufactured composure that was so visibly manufactured that Amelia almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She held Isabella's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away, because 2 seconds was sufficient to communicate everything, and she had nothing further to say on the subject. What happened next moved faster than she had expected. At 9:22, Gerald Harmon stood from the table and walked toward Julian's cluster with the deliberate movement of a man who had made a decision. She tracked him peripherally. He reached, Julian waited for a gap in the congratulations and leaned in to say something brief and private. She watched Julian's response, the slight change in his posture, the way his head turned a fraction of a degree toward the board table, toward Amelia's position, then back to Harmon. Whatever Harmon had said had introduced something Julian hadn't expected. Julian's smile did not falter. He was too good for that. But his eyes moved differently after that conversation, with a searching quality that hadn't been there during his speech, a new awareness that something in the room was not running according to his map. He extracted himself from the congratulatory cluster with polished ease and moved toward the side of the space where his chief of staff, a tight-faced man named Gordon, was waiting. She couldn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. She could read the exchange in Gordon's body language, the slight rigidity, the quick phone check, the way he turned so his mouth was not visible to the room before he spoke. Julian listened, and for the first time all evening, the performance slipped by a degree. Not dramatically, nothing that most people in the room would notice, but she noticed it. His head dropped a quarter inch, his jaw tightened. And then he pulled himself back up with the particular effort of a man who understood that this was not the moment to show what he was feeling. He looked across the room. He found her table. He found Walter Grayson sitting beside her. And something moved behind his eyes that she recognized as the specific fear of a man who has just realized that the story he was telling might not be the only story in the room. She looked back at him calmly and lifted her water glass in a gesture so small it was barely a gesture at all. He turned away. At 9:38, 3 investors from the secondary table independently made their way to Walter Grayson. Not as a group separately, with the spacing of people who had not coordinated, but had arrived at the same instinct. Each of them greeted Amelia as they arrived, and each greeting was warmer than it had any right to be given the history which told her that Diane or Raymond's preparation had worked its way through the financial networks in the precise, quiet way she had designed it to. These people didn't know everything yet, but they knew enough to reposition themselves. Julian across the room watched all 3 conversations happen. He had stopped talking to Gordon. He was watching with the focused, controlled attention of a man trying to understand a pattern he couldn't yet name. At 9:44, a journalist from Meridian Financial Network, one of the four Julian had invited for his own benefit, drifted away from the media section and toward the board table. He didn't approach Amelia directly. He positioned himself within earshot of the investor conversations and opened his notepad with the studied casualness of a man who had recognized that something was happening at this table that hadn't been in the evening's program. Amelia said nothing to the journalist. She didn't need to. The room was doing the work she had designed it to do. Information moving through social networks the way it always moved, not in announcements, but in shifts, in subtle recalibrations of attention, in the small but unmistakable gravity of people moving toward where the actual power was sitting. At 9:51, Walter Grayson set down his champagne glass, straightened in his chair, and said quietly to no one in particular, "I think it's time." She looked at him. He looked at her. He gave a single small nod. She reached into her clutch and placed the sealed envelope on the table in front of her, where it sat with the quiet, undramatic authority of a document that contained everything. Across the room, Julian was heading back toward the stage. His communications director had signaled the lighting technician, and the room's ambient lighting was dimming slightly, the signal that a second stage moment was coming. He had planned a second address, a toast, another opportunity to shape the narrative. He didn't know that Walter Grayson was already standing. He didn't know that every board member in the room had received at that exact moment a notification on their phone from the formal legal filing system that Diane used a confirmation message time-stamped and sealed that had been set to deliver at 9:52 precisely. He didn't know that the journalist from Meridian Financial Network had just lowered his notepad and raised his phone to record. He didn't know any of it. He walked toward the stage the way he had walked through every room of his life, as if the room belonged to him, because every room always had. He climbed the 2 steps to the stage. He picked up the microphone. He looked out at the audience with a smile so comfortable and so complete that for a single moment, watching him, she understood something she had not entirely expected to feel. She didn't hate him. She had thought she might when this moment arrived. But what she felt standing at the edge of the most important moment of the last 3 years of her life was something much quieter and much more resolved than hate. She felt the particular clarity of a woman who had been told she was nothing and had spent 3 years becoming the answer to that lie and was now sitting in a room full of witnesses waiting for the truth to speak. Julian opened his mouth to begin. Walter Grayson said clearly and without hesitation into the space before Julian's first word landed, "Julian, I need a moment." The room turned. Julian's smile held. He said into the microphone with the practiced grace of a man who had handled interruptions before, "Walter, of course, just 1 second I wanted to—" "It can't wait," Walter said, and something in his voice made the room go very still, not loud, not aggressive, just completely undeniably certain. Julian looked at him, looked at the table where Amelia was sitting, where the sealed envelope was visible on the white tablecloth, looked at the board members who were not looking at him, looked at the investors who were looking at Amelia. He looked back at Walter, and for the first time in the entire evening, Julian Croft's smile did not hold. The silence that followed Walter Grayson's words was the kind that a room only produced when everyone in it understood simultaneously that something irreversible was about to happen. Not the polite quiet of an audience settling before a speech, something harder and more electric than that, the kind of silence that had weight. Julian still had the microphone. His hand tightened around it. She could see the adjustment in his grip from where she was sitting, and he produced a sound that was almost a laugh, the specific social tool of a man who needed to reframe an unexpected moment as something smaller than it was. "Walter, whatever it is, I'm sure it can—" "It cannot," Walter said, and he was already standing, already moving toward the stage with the measured authority of a 70-year-old man who had chaired enough boards to know exactly what his voice sounded like when it needed to fill a room. "I apologize to our guests for the interruption, but there is a material matter of company governance that requires immediate acknowledgement, and as chairman of the Croft Industries Board of Directors, it is my legal obligation to address it in front of the relevant stakeholders who are present tonight." The word legal did something to the room. She watched it move through the crowd like a current, the investors straightening slightly, the journalists' phones coming up, the board members' faces going carefully neutral, in the way that faces went neutral, when people who understood corporate law recognized that something procedurally significant was occurring. Julian lowered the microphone. He looked at Walter with the expression of a man who had just felt the floor shift beneath him and was still deciding whether it had actually moved or whether he was imagining it. Walter. His voice was lower now, stripped of the performance register, speaking the name as a question and a warning simultaneously. Walter reached the edge of the stage. He did not climb the steps. He turned to face the room from the floor, which was a choice he was not taking, Julian's stage. He was addressing the room from within it, as a member of it, which was exactly the right register for what he was about to say. 3 years ago, Walter began, and his voice was the voice of a man reading from a document he had memorized so thoroughly it lived in his bones. Croft Industries underwent a series of significant internal changes that affected both its leadership structure and its shareholder configuration. Over the course of the last 36 months, a systematic acquisition of company equity was conducted through a series of properly disclosed holding entities in full compliance with all applicable securities law and exchange regulations. Julian said sharply, "Walter, every threshold was respected." Walter continued as if Julian had not spoken. Every filing was current. Every position was legally acquired and legally held. And as of the close of business on Wednesday of this week, the cumulative equity position held by the acquiring party reached 53.4% of total outstanding Croft Industries shares, constituting a legal majority ownership stake. The room did not explode. That was what she had anticipated, some dramatic eruption, the kind that happened in movies. Instead, what happened was stranger and more profound. The room contracted. Every person in it seemed to draw one careful breath at the same time and then hold it. And in that held breath was the specific collective recognition of people processing something that rearranged everything they thought they understood about where they were standing. Julian's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of a man speaking through something that had seized in his chest. What acquiring party? Walter reached into his breast pocket and produced a single folded document. He unfolded it with 2 hands, the way one handled something that mattered. "The majority shareholder of Croft Industries," he said, "is Amelia Davenport." 4 seconds of absolute silence. Then the room broke open. Not violently, not in the way of chaos, in the way of 100 separate conversations beginning at once, of chairs moving, of phones being raised, of the particular controlled bedlam of people in professional environments trying to process extraordinary information while maintaining the composure their positions required. The Meridian Financial Network journalist was recording. 3 others she hadn't noticed before had their phones up. Gerald Harmon had both hands flat on the table in front of him and was staring at a fixed point on the tablecloth. Thomas Reek had turned entirely in his chair to look at her. Julian was looking at her too. Across the full width of the room, through all the noise and motion of the crowd between them, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She had seen him angry. She had seen him calculating. She had seen him performing and grieving and dismissing and proud. She had not seen this. This was a man encountering the complete collapse of a structure he had believed was permanent in real time, in front of everyone he had ever needed to impress. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was something more foundational than either the expression of a man whose understanding of the world had just been revealed as a fiction he had been living inside. Amelia stood. She did it quietly without announcement, and because the room's attention was fractured across a dozen simultaneous reactions, almost no one noticed immediately. She picked up the sealed envelope from the table, which she had already opened in her clutch. She was holding not the envelope itself, but the single page inside it, the acquisition confirmation bearing her name, the company name, the percentage, and Diane Whitmore's signature alongside the signatures of 3 independent legal witnesses, and she walked toward the stage. The crowd parted. Not because she demanded it, because the room's social intelligence operating on instinct recognized that the person moving toward the stage was the person the room was about to center on. Julian stepped back. One step, not dramatic, not a retreat, but a step. She noted it without reacting to it and climbed the 2 steps to the stage, accepted the microphone from Walter with a quiet thank you that only he could hear, and turned to face the room. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times across 3 years. In the early months, the version she imagined had been triumphant, charged with the anger she was still metabolizing, shaped by the desire to make everyone in the room feel the weight of what had been done to her. Later, as the anger became something quieter and more structural, the version changed, became less about performance and more about accuracy. She wasn't here to punish him, she was here to correct the record. She looked at the room, and she said in the same level and human voice she used for every important conversation, "I want to start by thanking Walter for the clarity of that introduction, and I want to apologize to everyone here for the disruption to what has been a genuinely beautiful evening." She paused 1 beat. "Though I suspect by the end of tonight most of you will understand why the timing was necessary." A ripple of something moved through the crowd. Not laughter, not exactly, but the social release of people recognizing that the person speaking was not going to be theatrical about this, which made it more significant, not less. Julian said from 2 feet behind her, with a control so absolute it was almost impressive, "This is not the appropriate forum for Julian." She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the room and said his name with the same unshakable calm she had brought to every difficult moment since she had decided to stop being afraid of them. "You chose this forum. You invited me here. You put cameras in the room. You arranged for the media placement yourself." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'm simply using the forum you provided." The room was utterly still. She held the document at her side, not brandishing it, not performing with it, simply holding it in the way of someone who has what they need and does not require to wave it around. 3 years ago," she said, "Julian stood in front of cameras and described me as someone who had held this company back, as dead weight, as a mistake he was grateful to be free of." She let the words sit in the air without any particular drama attached to them, because they didn't need drama. They were what they were, and everyone in the room either knew them already or was about to understand their significance. He said it publicly, deliberately, with enough force that the message was clear to everyone who needed to hear it. I was to be associated with failure, with poor judgment, with the past. She looked at Gerald Harmon, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been in that original audience and knew exactly what she was referring to. Then she looked at Patricia Gould, who had heard those words and made her social calculations accordingly. Then she looked at the journalist from Meridian Financial Network, whose recorder was running. "I did not fight that narrative publicly," Amelia continued. "I made a different choice. I went to work." She allowed herself 1 moment, not a dramatic pause, just a breath, the kind of natural human pause that occurred when someone was about to say the thing that mattered most. "What you are holding in your notifications tonight, what Walter has just confirmed on the record, is the result of 3 years of work that was conducted entirely within the boundaries of the law, entirely through proper disclosure channels, and entirely without a single action that can be successfully challenged in any court in this country." She looked directly at Julian's legal director, who was standing near the side wall with a phone pressed hard against his ear. "I am aware that certain individuals are currently making phone calls. I would ask them to save the effort until morning, because by morning, Diane Whitmore's office will have a complete procedural file prepared for any review that is requested. Every position, every filing, every timeline, all of it is there." Julian's legal director lowered his phone slightly. He did not put it away. At 10:19, something happened that she had not precisely planned for, but had considered as a possibility. A man near the back of the room, one of the larger institutional investors, a man named Franklin Voss, who had been a Croft Industries supporter for 7 years, raised his hand slightly, the gesture of someone in a professional setting who wants to ask a question but is uncertain whether the floor is open. She looked at him. "Mr. Voss?" He seemed mildly startled that she knew his name, which was, she supposed, the point. "Ms. Davenport," he said carefully, "can you speak to your intentions with respect to the company's operational direction going forward?" It was the right question, and he had asked it correctly, which told her that Franklin Voss was going to be someone worth working with in the months ahead. She said, "The company's current operational structure will be reviewed by the board in the normal course over the next 60 days. Nothing is dismantled overnight. The workforce, the client relationships, the ongoing projects, none of that changes by virtue of a change in ownership. What changes is governance, and governance changes through the board, through legal process, through the proper sequence." She held his gaze. "Croft Industries is a strong company. It has genuinely good people in it. My ownership does not change that. My ownership ensures that the people who built this company will have leadership that reflects what this company actually is, rather than a performance of what one person needs it to appear to be." Franklin Voss sat down. Around him she could see the specific posture shift of people recalibrating, not just processing the information, but beginning already to think forward. That was when Julian moved. He crossed the stage in 3 steps and stood beside her. Not in front of her, not between her and the microphone, but beside her, because he was controlled enough to understand that physically blocking her would be the wrong visual in a room full of cameras. He said quietly enough that the microphone barely caught it, "You need to stop this." She looked at him. Up close, the closest they had been in 3 years, he looked older than his public appearances suggested. Not old, but carrying something. The particular exhaustion of a man who had been performing certainty for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a muted and entirely uncomplicated sadness, not for herself, for the waste of it, for the 12 years and the intelligence he genuinely had, and the company she had helped build, and the way none of it had been enough for him. He had needed to diminish someone to feel complete, and he had chosen her, and now the consequence of that choice was standing on his stage, holding the paper that ended his tenure. She said very quietly, "Julian, I'm not going to stop. And you know that." He searched her face for something. She wasn't sure what. A negotiating position, maybe? A crack in the composure. Something that would tell him there was still a version of this that could be managed. He looked for a long time and found nothing, and she watched him understand in the specific and irreversible way that things were understood when they could no longer be avoided that this was real. He stepped back. He turned away from her. He walked to the edge of the stage and stood there with his back to the room, and it was the first genuinely unperformed thing she had seen him do in 3 years. Just a man standing at the edge of something trying to locate the ground. She let him have that moment. She turned back to the room and said clearly, "The board of directors will convene for an emergency session Monday morning. Walter Grayson, as chairman, will facilitate that session. All relevant documentation has been distributed to board members through the appropriate legal channels." She paused. "That is all I need to say tonight." She handed the microphone back to Walter. She picked up her document. She walked down the 2 steps from the stage and moved toward her table, and the room made way for her, the same way it had made way for Julian an hour earlier, except that this time the movement was not choreographed. Social deference, it was something more instinctive, the recognition of actual weight, actual gravity. She sat down. Marcus appeared from the perimeter of the room. She hadn't known exactly where he was positioned, only that he was there, and placed a hand briefly on the back of her chair without saying anything. She appreciated that. She didn't need words. She needed exactly what he gave her, which was the quiet confirmation that he was present and that things were proceeding as they should. What followed was not silence, but something equally extraordinary, the sound of a room reorganizing itself. Conversation starting, then starting again, with entirely different content than they'd had 20 minutes earlier. People moving, people avoiding, the specific social physics of a power shift in real time, where individuals who had invested themselves in one narrative were now visibly and somewhat frantically calculating the cost and benefit of adjusting their position. Isabella was the first truly dramatic movement. She had been standing near the east wall. Amelia had tracked her peripherally. Throughout and at 10:27, 3 minutes after Amelia left the stage, Isabella put down her champagne glass and walked out of the ballroom without speaking to Julian, without looking back, without the performance of a scene. Just gone, quietly, efficiently. In the specific way of a person who had always known which version of this story they were willing to be part of, and had just determined that this version was not it. Amelia saw it happen. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to recognition. Isabella had made her choices consistently throughout their history, always toward advantage, always away from cost. This was simply the most recent iteration. Clean, at least. Honest in its way. Julian. When he finally came down from the stage, did not come toward her. He found Gordon, his chief of staff, in the corner near the media section, and they stood together with the body language of two people conducting a very quiet emergency conversation. Gordon's phone was out. Julian was listening more than he was talking, which was unusual for him, and she took it as a sign that the legal picture had been communicated to him in terms specific enough that he had run out of counter-narrative to offer. At 10:34, Gerald Harmon appeared beside her table. He stood rather than sitting, which was either uncertainty or deference, or both. He said without preamble, "I want you to know that I reviewed the documentation carefully before I confirmed my alignment. I want to be clear about that." She looked up at him. "I know you did, Gerald. Diane told me. I also want to say—" He stopped, tried again. "I was in the room 3 years ago when he said those things about you." He looked uncomfortable in a genuine rather than performed way. "I should have said something at the time." She held his gaze with the same evenness she had maintained all evening. "You're saying it now," she said. "That's what matters going forward." He nodded once with the careful gravity of a man accepting terms he understood were generous and moved away. Thomas Reek came next, then Patricia Gould's husband, not Patricia herself, who had apparently decided the evening required her to be elsewhere, and then, unexpectedly, Franklin Voss, who shook her hand with both of his and said simply, "I look forward to Monday," which was the most efficient thing anyone had said to her all night. Through all of it, she was aware of Julian at the edge of the room, not watching her constantly, that would have been too obvious, but returning to her position the way eyes return to something they couldn't fully process. She understood what was happening inside him. In the abstract way she could understand things about him after 12 years of close proximity. He was trying to find the error, the procedural gap, the legal vulnerability, the move she had made that could be reversed. He was running his own architecture through his mind at speed, looking for the load-bearing wall that, if removed, would bring her structure down. He would not find it. Diane had made certain of that, and Diane Whitmore did not leave load-bearing walls exposed. At 10:51, Gordon crossed the room and arrived at Amelia's table with the demeanor of a man executing a task he had been assigned, rather than one he had chosen. He said, "Mr. Croft would like a few minutes, privately." She considered it for exactly the length of time it deserved. "Tell Julian that any conversation about the company should happen Monday morning through the board. Tell him that tonight is not the appropriate setting for that discussion." She paused. "And tell him I hope he gets home safely." Gordon looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Then he said, "I'll pass that along," and left. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. "Do you want to leave?" "Not yet," she said. 20 more minutes. I want to be present in the room while the room settles. Then we go." She spent those 20 minutes doing something that surprised even herself. She moved through the room slowly, speaking to people, not about what had happened, not defensively, not triumphantly, but simply and normally. She asked Franklin Voss about a project she'd read about his firm undertaking in the Southeast. She spoke briefly to a woman she'd known years ago, who was now running a mid-sized private equity fund, and who greeted her with the kind of genuine warmth that told Amelia she had been watching from a distance and had already drawn her own conclusions about what kind of person Amelia had become. She even spoke for 2 minutes with Patricia Gould, who reappeared with a champagne glass and the look of a woman recalculating everything, and who said with a very small but entirely sincere smile, "You were always the most capable person in that marriage, Amelia. I think a number of us knew that." Amelia said, "Thank you, Patricia," and moved on. At 11:15, she collected her clutch from the table, said a final quiet word to Walter Grayson. "Monday morning, 8 o'clock, I'll be there," and walked through the ballroom toward the exit. She did not look for Julian as she left. She did not look for Isabella. She looked at the room one final time with the particular attention of someone who had spent 3 years imagining a single night and was now leaving it behind because the night had done what it needed to do and she was already thinking about Monday. The lobby was quieter than it had been when she arrived. The coat check attendant retrieved her case without being asked. Marcus was already by the door with her coat. Outside, the November air was cold and clear, and immediate, a sensation so physical after the compressed heat of the ballroom that she stopped for a moment on the steps and simply breathed it. Marcus stood beside her and said nothing. He was very good at that. She said, "Call the car." He made the call. While they waited, she stood on the steps of the Grand Meridian Hotel and looked at the city that had watched her be erased 3 years ago, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in all the time she had been building toward this night. Not triumph she had known from the beginning, that triumph was the wrong frame. Something more complete and more quiet than triumph. The feeling of a thing that had been broken being set correctly back into place. The feeling of the record reflecting what was true. She had walked into that building as the woman Julian Croft had tried to make into a symbol of his rightness. She was leaving it as the owner of his company. And more than that, more than the ownership, more than the legal confirmation, more than the look on his face when he understood she was leaving as herself. Completely, precisely, irrevocably herself. The car arrived. She got in. The car ride home took 11 minutes. She counted them without meaning to, the way a person counted small increments after a large thing had happened, as if the ordinary measurement of time was a way of confirming that the world was still running on its normal axis. Marcus sat beside her and did not speak, which was correct. There was nothing to say that the evening had not already said more completely and permanently than any conversation could. She got home at 11:31. She changed out of the navy dress, hung it carefully, and sat at her kitchen island in the particular quiet of an apartment after a long and significant night. She made tea. She drank it standing up. She thought about nothing specific and everything at once, the way the mind moved in the immediate aftermath of a thing it had been pointed toward for a very long time. She went to bed at midnight and slept without difficulty. Sunday arrived gray and cold, which suited her. She worked in the morning on client matters that had nothing to do with Croft. Industries took a long walk in the early afternoon and spoke to her mother again in the evening. Still not about the gala, because her mother read the financial press occasionally, but not obsessively, and Amelia wanted to tell her version of it in person rather than have her mother encounter it through a headline. The headline she understood was already out. Marcus had sent her 3 links by midday. Meridian Financial Network had posted their piece at 2 in the morning. 2 other outlets had followed by 6. By Sunday evening, the story had moved through financial media with the specific velocity of something that contained both corporate intrigue and personal drama, which meant it had moved very fast and very far. She did not read the articles in full. She read the headlines and the opening paragraphs enough to understand the narrative that was forming, and then she put her phone down. The story that mattered was not the one in the press. The story that mattered was the one in the boardroom, and that story began Monday morning at 8 o'clock. She arrived at Croft Industries headquarters at 7:45. The building was one she had been inside hundreds of times. She had helped choose the architecture firm, had been present for 3 of the floor. Redesigns had spent enough hours in these corridors that her feet knew the layout without her having to think about it. Walking in now felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not triumphant, not nostalgic, something more precise than either. The feeling of returning to a place that had once been yours and finding that your relationship to it had changed in ways that made it both familiar and entirely new. The security desk recognized her. The young man on duty, she didn't know him. He had clearly been hired in the last 2 years, checked her name against the visitor list, which told her that Walter had done his job correctly, and her access was logged without requiring any additional explanation. She thanked him and went up. The boardroom was on the 24th floor. She had been in this room for 12 years of quarterly reviews and strategy sessions, and the particular intensity of decisions that shaped large amounts of money and large numbers of lives. She knew where the light came in strongest in the morning. She knew which chair had the broken caster that always needed to be managed carefully. She knew that the coffee the building served was always slightly too hot for the first 10 minutes, and that Walter Grayson preferred his with no sugar and exactly enough cream to change the color by 1 shade. She knew these things because she had paid attention for 12 years. That was what attention did. It accumulated into knowledge, and knowledge in the right hands was the most durable form of power there was. Walter was already in the room when she arrived. Diane was there too, seated to the left with a leather portfolio and the particular composed alertness of a woman who had spent 5 decades in rooms like this and found them neither intimidating nor comfortable, but simply functional. Nolan Raymond's associate sat at the far end with a laptop and a stillness that reminded her of Raymond himself. The board members arrived in clusters over the next 10 minutes, Gerald Harmon and Thomas Reek together. Then 2 others she knew well, then Franklin Voss, who had apparently been formally invited to observe as a major institutional investor, and who nodded to her when he entered with the specific nod of a man who had made a decision about which side of something he was on. Julian was not there. She had not expected him to be not at the start. His attorneys had requested a delay of 48 hours. She had received the communication through Diane's office at 6 that morning. The request had been declined politely and in writing with the relevant procedural citations that established why the timeline could not be modified. This was not punitive. This was simply correct. The board had legal obligations triggered by a change of majority ownership, and those obligations did not pause for personal convenience. At 8 o'clock exactly, Walter called the session to order. What followed was 3 hours of the most careful and consequential work she had done since the acquisition itself. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but absolutely precise. Every document was reviewed. Every procedural step was confirmed on the record. The acquisition was validated by 3 independent confirmations: Diane's legal certification, the exchange filing record that Nolan pulled up on his laptop and shared to the room's display, and the board's own independent legal counsel, a firm that had no prior relationship with either Amelia or Julian, which Walter had engaged specifically to ensure that no one could accuse the process of being anything other than clean. There were questions. Gerald Harmon asked 3, all procedural, all answered directly. Thomas Reek asked 2 both about the timeline of the acquisition and whether any of the holding entity filings were currently under regulatory review. The answer to both was no, comprehensively documented with the relevant filings available for inspection. Franklin Voss asked 1 question, which was about the composition of Amelia's intended advisory team, and she answered it in enough detail that the room could tell she had been thinking about governance rather than simply ownership. At 10:47, the board took a formal vote on recognition of the ownership change and the corresponding governance implications. The vote was 6-0. Gerald Harmon voted yes without hesitation, which she noted and respected. Whatever doubts he had worked through over the past 72 hours, he had worked through them correctly. The formal resolution passed. Walter documented it on the record. The session paused briefly, and then Diane said into the quiet of the break, with the dry precision that was her particular form of warmth. "Congratulations, Amelia. You are now on the record exactly what you have been for the past several days, majority owner of Croft Industries." She said, "Thank you, Diane, for everything." Diane waved her hand in the manner of someone dismissing unnecessary sentiment, which was itself a form of it. "Buy me dinner when this is over, somewhere that has a decent wine list." "Done," Amelia said. At 11:15, Julian's attorney arrived. Not Julian, his attorney, a man named Preston Cole, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to representing people in difficult situations, and who entered the boardroom with the careful, measured composure of a man who had reviewed the documentation overnight and understood he was not here to contest, but to negotiate the terms of transition. He sat across from Diane, who looked at him the way a chess master looked at an opponent whose next 6 moves she had already mapped. Preston said after the appropriate formalities, "My client wishes to express that he respects the legal validity of the acquisition and has no intention of pursuing a procedural challenge." He paused. "He does, however, request a private conversation with Ms. Davenport, at her convenience and at her discretion." Diane looked at Amelia. Amelia looked at Preston Cole. "Tell your client I'll speak with him. Not today. Later this week when the immediate governance matters are resolved. Tell him to have his personal items from the executive office collected by Wednesday." Preston nodded and made a note. He did not look surprised. She suspected he had advised Julian to accept worse than this, and was relieved to be delivering better. "My client also wanted me to say—" He stopped, which was unusual for a man of his professional fluency. He tried again. "He wanted me to convey that he understands the situation was of his own making." She looked at Preston Cole steadily. "I know he does," she said. "That's not something he needs to convey. I'm glad he understands it. It will make what comes next easier for both of us." Preston gathered his papers and left. The boardroom exhaled, in the particular way of people who have been holding themselves at professional attention for 3 hours and were now permitted to be slightly more human. Gerald Harmon poured himself coffee. Thomas Reek leaned back in his chair. Walter turned to Amelia and said quietly and directly, "What do you need from us in the next 30 days?" She had a list. It was not a dramatic list. It was a precise and practical one, an operational review of 3 divisions she had identified as underperforming a compensation structure audit that she suspected would reveal several inequities that had been tolerated under Julian's tenure, and an external communication strategy that Nolan would help develop to ensure that the company's clients and partners received clear and reassuring messaging about the transition. None of this was punitive. All of it was necessary. She walked Walter through it for 40 minutes. He asked sharp questions. She answered them all. By the end, the shape of the next 90 days was clear enough that everyone in the room could see it, and what they could see was a company being stabilized rather than punished, which was exactly what she needed them to see. The meeting broke at 1 in the afternoon. As people gathered their things, Franklin Voss appeared beside her with his hand extended. She shook it. He said, "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen hostile takeovers that were genuinely hostile. What you did was different." "It wasn't hostile," she said. "It was patient." He considered that for a moment. "That might be a more frightening word," he said, and he smiled, and she found that she liked him. She was in the elevator heading down when her phone rang. Daniel. She looked at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. Then she answered. "I saw," he said. No preamble. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him in a long time, stripped of the careful professional coating he usually wore down to something more raw and more real. "I saw everything, the articles, the board announcement." A pause. "Amelia, Daniel." She kept her voice level. "I left you," he said. "I chose his connections over you, and I left you. And you," his voice broke briefly, and she heard him pull it back together with effort. "You did all of that. 3 years of that. Alone." "Not alone," she said. "But yes, 3 years." The elevator opened. She walked through the lobby and out to where Marcus was waiting with the car. She stood on the sidewalk, not getting in yet, and held the phone against her ear while her brother tried to find the words for what he needed to say. "I don't expect you to," he started. "Daniel." She cut him off not harshly, but cleanly. "I'm not going to make a decision about what our relationship is going to look like in the next 60 seconds. That's not how I work, and you know that." She looked down the block at the city moving around her with complete indifference to the magnitude of the last 18 hours. "What I will tell you is that I'm still your sister. That hasn't changed. What I need from you if we're going to find our way back to something real is honesty. Not apology honesty. About what happened and why. And time. We need time." She paused. "Can you do that?" A long silence. Then quietly, "Yes." "Then call me next week," she said. "Not about the company, just to talk." She got in the car. "I have to go." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. Marcus glanced at her from the front. She said, "Take me to the office." Not her apartment. The office space she had quietly established 18 months ago for the holding entities, which would now transition into the primary operational base for her role at Croft Industries. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she had always been the kind of person for whom that was a comfort rather than a burden. The next 48 hours were dense with the particular administrative intensity of a major governance transition. Legal filings, communications to key company stakeholders, a call with the company's largest external client that went 40 minutes and ended with the client expressing cautious optimism. A brief and carefully managed press statement drafted by Nolan and reviewed 3 times by Diane that described the ownership change in clear and professional terms without any personal narrative attached. She did not speak to the press directly. She had nothing to perform. The record spoke clearly enough. On Wednesday afternoon, she met with Julian. She had chosen a conference room in her new office neutral territory, not the Croft Industries building, not her apartment. Diane was present. Julian's attorney, Preston, was present. Julian arrived 6 minutes late, which she suspected was not an accident, and which she also did not react to, because 6 minutes was not a material fact. He looked worse than he had at the gala, and better than she would have expected given the circumstances. He had not slept well that was visible, the particular quality of someone who had spent 2 nights inside a significant loss. But he was composed. He sat across from her, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from the one she had seen on the stage Saturday night. That expression had been shock and collapse. This one was something she hadn't anticipated, which was a kind of exhausted clarity. The expression of a man who had run out of stories to tell himself and was sitting for perhaps the first time in years inside the unmediated truth of his situation. She said, "How are you, Julian?" He looked at her. "You don't need to do that." "I'm asking sincerely," she said. "Whatever happened between us and whatever I did in response to it, you are a person, and I'm asking how you are." A silence. Then, "I've been better." He said it with the ghost of the self-deprecating humor he had possessed before he became so invested in his own performance that humor became a liability. It was the most human thing she had heard from him in a very long time. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not here to destroy what you built. The company is genuinely strong in several areas. The people in it did not do anything to me. My responsibility going forward is to those people and to the company's health, not to settling a personal account." She held his gaze. "Julian, you are an intelligent man. You built something real. You also did things that were wrong to me publicly, deliberately, and I am not going to pretend those things didn't happen or that they didn't have a cost. But that cost has now been settled by the market of consequence. I own the company. You don't. That is the correction the situation required." He listened to this without interrupting, which was itself a change. The Julian she had been married to interrupted constantly, not aggressively, but because he processed faster than most people spoke and couldn't help himself. This Julian sat still and listened until she was finished. Then he said, "You were always better at this than I was." She waited. The patience, he said, he paused, searching for the word, the willingness to take the long view. "I always knew you were the better strategic mind. I just convinced myself it didn't matter because I had the name." He looked at the table. "I convinced myself a lot of things that weren't true." The room was very quiet. Preston Cole looked at his notepad. Diane looked at the middle distance with the discipline of a woman who understood that some moments did not require her. Amelia said, "What do you want to do next with your time, your work, outside of this company?" He looked up, slightly surprised by the question. "I don't know yet." "That's an honest answer," she said. "It's a good starting place." They spent the next 2 hours with the attorneys working through the transition terms. He was cooperative. Not enthusiastically, not with any visible relief, but with the specific cooperation of a man who had accepted a reality and was trying to navigate it with whatever dignity remained available to him. She respected that more than she would have respected a performance of graciousness. When it was done and the papers were signed, the formal resignation documents, the transition timeline, the terms of his departure package, which were fair rather than punitive, because she had never intended them to be punitive, he stood to leave. Preston gathered his materials. Diane made notes. Julian paused at the door. He turned back. He looked at her with the kind of look that existed outside of professional contexts. Just a person looking at another person across the accumulated wreckage and history of something that had mattered. He said, "I'm sorry for the press conference, for what I said." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said, "and I believe you." She paused. "It doesn't undo it, but it counts for something." He nodded once. He left. Diane waited until the door closed, then said without looking up from her notes, "That was generous." "It was accurate," Amelia said. "There's a difference." Diane looked up then with the particular expression she reserved for things that impressed her, which was rare enough to be significant. "Yes," she said, "I suppose there is." The weeks that followed were the busiest of her life, including the busiest years of the marriage, including the most intense periods of the acquisition itself. Running a company of Croft Industries' scale was not a theoretical exercise. It was daily, hourly, relentless. She had prepared for this, but preparation and reality always contained a gap. And she spent the first month closing that gap through the specific combination of intelligence, discipline, and willingness to ask questions that she had always brought to hard problems. She hired a CEO to manage daily operations, not because she lacked the ability, but because the CEO role required a specific kind of daily presence that was different from the strategic ownership role she intended to occupy, and she knew the difference. The CEO she chose was a woman named Carla Jensen, who had run 2 successful mid-size firms and who looked at Amelia across the interview table with the direct, unflustered attention of someone who wasn't going to be managed by intimidation or impressed by performance. Amelia hired her on the spot. She restored the communications function that Julian had quietly defunded in the final 2 years of his tenure. She initiated the compensation audit, which revealed exactly what she had expected, a systematic pattern of undervaluing the people who had done the most actual work, while overcompensating the people most visibly adjacent to Julian's public image. She corrected the structure. It cost money in the short term, and she spent it without hesitation. She had 2 conversations with Marcus about his own role, and the second one ended with him accepting a formal position as her chief of operations with a compensation package that made him go briefly quiet, and then say, "Amelia, this is," and she said, "Correct, that's what it is," and they moved on. 3 months after the gala, Meridian Financial Network ran a long profile. She did the interview and answered every question directly, including the difficult ones about the marriage, about the divorce, about what the 3 years of building had cost her personally. She did not perform resilience for the camera. She did not use the language of inspiration or empowerment or any of the other vocabulary that got attached to stories like hers in ways that made the actual work invisible. She spoke plainly about what she had done and why and what it had required. And when the interviewer asked whether she felt vindicated, she thought about the word for a long time before answering. "Vindication suggests there was a verdict I was waiting for," she said finally. "I wasn't waiting for a verdict. I was waiting for the work to be complete. Those are different things. A verdict is something someone else delivers. This was something I built." She looked at the interviewer steadily. "I don't need Julian Croft or any room full of investors to vindicate me. I needed to know that what I built was sound. It is. That's enough." The profile ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been shared widely enough that her phone spent the day vibrating with messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, and a few she hadn't spoken to in longer than that. She read the messages in batches, responded to the ones that mattered, and left the rest for the following week. One message came from Claire Heston, the woman she had nearly collided with in the lobby the week before the gala. It said simply, "I always knew. I should have said so louder. I'm glad the world knows now." She replied, "Thank you, Claire." Then after a moment she added, "I'm looking for a strong head of investor relations. Call me." Claire called within the hour. 6 months after the gala, she sat in the office on the 24th floor, not the one Julian had occupied, which she had converted into a conference room, but the one adjacent to it, slightly smaller, with a better view of the actual city, rather than the performative skyline shot Julian had preferred. And she reviewed the company's quarterly numbers with Carla Jensen for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. The numbers were strong. Not spectacularly, so she had never been interested in spectacle, but solidly, sustainably strong. The kind of numbers that told a story of a company being run well, rather than a company being used to tell a story about its leader. When Carla left, Amelia sat alone in the office for a few minutes in the specific quiet of a room where important work happened, but didn't need to announce itself. She thought about the woman who had sat on the floor of a bedroom 3 years ago and felt the full weight of being erased. She thought about the morning she had gotten up from that floor, packed one bag, and decided that disappearing was not the same as being gone. She thought about patience not as a virtue in the abstract, not as a comfort one offered to people in difficult circumstances, but as a strategy, as a form of intelligence, as the particular discipline of understanding that the most powerful thing you could do in certain situations was to refuse to let the situation rush you, to hold your own timeline with both hands against the pressure of other people's urgency. to build carefully in silence, with the knowledge that what was built carefully in silence was 10 times more durable than what was constructed quickly and loudly for an audience. Julian had built for audiences his entire life. He had needed them. The press, the investors, the social validation, the room full of eyes confirming his version of reality. He had built something real genuinely, she had never denied that, but he had built it in a way that required constant external confirmation to feel solid. The moment the confirmation changed, the structure revealed its vulnerability. She had built in the opposite direction, inward, downward, foundation by foundation in the dark, without an audience, without confirmation, without the reassurance of anyone outside her small and trusted circle telling her she was on the right path. She had known she was on the right path because the work was sound, and the work was legal, and the work was true, and she had been right. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring the way she always did and said, "How's my girl?" the way she always did, and Amelia said, "Good, Mom, really good," and meant it in a way that was full and uncomplicated and entirely real. They talked for 30 minutes about the coast trip her mother had finally taken, about a book that had made her mother cry in the good way about the garden and the weather and the small, precise details of a life being lived well. Amelia listened and laughed and felt in that ordinary phone call everything she had been working toward, distilled into its simplest and most essential form. This, exactly this, the ability to be present, to be whole, to be herself without the weight of someone else's narrative pressing down on the conversation. When she hung up, the office was quiet. The city moved outside without needing her attention. The quarterly numbers sat in their folders solid and true. 3 years of silence had become this, not the dramatic single moment of a public reckoning, though that moment had been necessary and real, but the ongoing daily reality of a woman who knew who she was, who had built something that reflected that knowledge, and who moved through her own life on her own terms. She turned back to her desk and opened the next file. Julian Croft had sent her an invitation to her own humiliation and handed her the stage she needed. He had spent 3 years believing she was gone. She had spent those same 3 years becoming the one thing he had never anticipated and could not have defended against. Not a rival, not an enemy, not a woman consumed by revenge, but something far more durable than any of those. She had become completely and without apology the most powerful person in the room he had built. And she had done it the only way that mattered, not by taking anything from him, but by building something that was entirely, irreducibly, permanently her own.